And welcome to another class in the bunker. We're glad to have you here live. The fun part about being live is that here's a chance for all of us to get together. So one of the things I have to tell you that I really do appreciate us doing is you taking the time to say, hey, we're here from Prosper. The Kovaches are here. They're in the house. And we're here from all over the place. So please take time to do that and just indicate where you're checking in from. It also helps to like the page just a little bit so that we get a sense of who all is here and enjoying this entire process. Now, let me mention one other thing before we get started, just kind of in the housekeeping kind of things. Just a reminder that generally what would happen with this class, for those that have been attending with us since January, is that we would have been ending right about now. In fact, we probably would have been done, had our oral final buffet, and we would have been finished and done, and then take a summer break. With the virus seclusion and everything that we're in, we've made the determination that we want to continue to do this until we're back in church. I don't know when that is. I don't know if we're going to be looking at a situation like this anytime soon. But I want to continue to do this at 2 o'clock Central Daylight Time until we're completely all back. And at that point, I may continue to do this, but then put them on a YouTube channel with the same name, which I've already created. I'm already starting to upload things to the YouTube channel to be able to do that. So I'm going to continue to keep going. I think that would be the best thing to do. I'm enjoying it. The feedback I'm getting from people is that you're enjoying it. Good grief. Last week, we went over 850 views. And so it gives you an idea of the community of us that are out there and really kind of enjoying having this format in lieu of the other things that we could be doing. That said, that means what comes next. I tried to make this class the teachings of Paul, so I've specifically been looking at the teachings of Paul, and we're kind of running out of those in the next few weeks. I have to make a decision what we're doing after the next few weeks, whether to finish maybe the New Testament, look at Peter, look at James, some of the others. The other possibility with a shortened period of time, because I'm expecting church to maybe be back July, August. We're kind of hoping for that, but that gives us a shorter period of time. The other possibility would be to do something like the Pearl of Great Price, which could be done in a shorter period of time and might be something that normally in a full semester time we would kind of run out of space to do. I'm thinking about that. And of course, I've had other desires that maybe for the duration that we do kind of a Come Follow Me, and we match a little bit closer to Come Follow Me, which would be back to the Book of Mormon. And that certainly is a possibility, though I think there's a number of good online sources as we're trying to do that. So the other thing I'd ask in your comments after today's class or during today's class, please indicate maybe a little bit what you might want to see where we take this class and where we go from here, so that we're able to kind of move it in a direction that would be fun and would be enjoyable in a way that we would really like to have things work. So, okay, that's it. We got the housekeeping out of the way. I did find it interesting from a church standpoint. The church is looking at ways of a phase 1 possibility of moving us back to church, full of spaces and masks and less than 99 in a meeting. And we may end up going there, and that may work. This tears at my heart, to be honest, just a little bit. Wow. If we look at a church as a community, people where we hug and we shake hands and we high five and we congregate, boy, there would be something missing here. And if we do it, we'll make it work. But it could very well be that for a lot of church leaders, they kind of say, this would get us back to church is not necessarily what we're looking for. But certainly there have been a number of people, especially those singles community, not yet married, for whom they don't have an in-house family group that they can meet with, and they've been pretty isolated. And this might be the thing that would at least get them back taking the sacrament more on a regular basis. So, man, really stay tuned. Now, if that happens, I did post this on Facebook. I thought that was pretty clever by another church, where they started using blue tape to blue tape off. People are coming to church, but you can't sit in some places. And in this case, they said, remember when the Lord kicked Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden and put a flaming sword there to guard the entrance so they couldn't come back? In the original language, flaming sword can also be translated as blue tape. And it says, so don't cry. So there's like an angel here. It looks like blue tape, but it's really an angel. Don't sit in that pew. It's not 6 feet away. That was pretty good. Now, for the things that we want to be able to talk about today, I noticed that one of my favorite quotes is a quote by who I call Elder C.S. Lewis. People cringe a little bit when I go Elder C.S. Lewis. I just assume C.S. Lewis is in like the Quorum of the 12 in the spirit world. He's that kind of guy. Because he made a statement on pride that I thought was pretty terrific. And here's what he said. I found it on a Facebook page. What he said is, pride is essentially competitive. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having something more than the next man. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they're really not. They're really proud of being richer or clever or better looking than others. Finally, he says, it is the comparison that makes you proud. Listen closely. It's the comparison that makes you proud. The pleasure of being above the rest. One of the elements of competition. And when that's gone, pride is gone. Now, by the way, I did find this hilarious. That in looking for this quote, so that I could use this today about C.S. Lewis and pride, one of my favorite quotes. I looked at some of the Facebook comments on that, and you just have to love this. Talking about pride is not competitive. One man says, true, however, there are some forms of competition that bring out the best, and it's the lack of humility in respect that brings the downfall. And the mansplainer on the bottom goes, no, competition is unnecessary. If people did all they did with the Lord with excellent competition, it may make for good entertainment, but it's only for the poorly motivated, And he's going, I'm going to argue with you about what pride is. And again, he's going, pride, me and you, and pride, me better, you less. And we kind of go back and forth with that. That was, you're proving our point in the comment section about pride. That said, pride is competitive. So sometimes what happens in a religious community is where the natural man part of us really wants to be competitive. Competition being, how do I know how I am? How do I know that I'm better or not? How do I know? If someone says I'm going to run the 40 in 4.5 seconds, which is actually pretty fast, we'd say, well, how do I know? Well, the only way I can know is by knowing how fast everybody else is running. Then I'll know whether I'm faster or not. And so what happens in a religious sense is, in a competitive world, how do I know I'm righteous? How do I know, especially if we believe that it's our works that save us, and it's our obedience that gets us into heaven? We're going to have to be able to say, how do I know I'm being obedient enough? how do I know I'm being righteous enough? In a competitive world, the only way I can know that I'm being competitive enough is I have to compare myself to you. Am I more righteous than you, or are you more righteous than me? How am I going to know? And so I've got to maybe do things that cause me to know that, hey, I'm being more righteous than you. And guess what? I will get the bigger mansion in heaven. You're going to have the small house on the cul-de-sac. I get the big one on a few acres because me righteous, you not so righteous. And especially when we start getting to those, not a matter of righteousness, it's a matter of me righteous, you wicked. So if you make it to heaven, you be in a small house, more than likely you're going to go to another place with lots of heat. I get the big mansion because me righteous, you not. We go to those places. And the problem with being competitive is, in order to be competitive, it requires us to be comparative. I have to compare myself to you. And then I've got to weigh the one versus the other, and that's how I will know that I'm being competitive. I'll be able to see my righteousness as I look at yours. Now, there's a phrase that kind of developed in the last few years when people are feeling righteous or they're feeling virtuous. The term they came up with, which I thought was kind of interesting, is when we talk about virtue signaling. I'm going to signal to the world that I am more virtuous than you are. Now, a good example, I think, and probably one of the better places for virtue signaling is when it gets to be election day, and we're going to exercise our responsibility to go vote. So what do? I'm going to get up, I'm going to wait in line, I'm going to go vote for the person that I think is the right person for this job. What do I do after? As I'm walking out, every time that I vote, they give me a little sticker. And the sticker, I put it proudly on my chest that says, I voted. That way I can walk out of the building and say, me, I voted. I was virtuous. I did the good thing. Now, why do they do that? They want people, election officials, want people to walk out with the I voted virtue signal that causes other people to say, I should be virtuous like them, and I shall go vote as well. So I can go get my sticker, and we will be two virtuous people sitting at work. Both of us say I voted. We are both virtuous. We can swim in our virtuosity of how virtuous we are. The virtual signaling happens, though, when we say, I have a sticker and you don't have a sticker. Did you vote today? Well, then you can't complain later, because I was virtuous. You were not virtuous. Virtuosity I need to have some way to let the world know that my virtueness has expanded and I'm doing great things and life is wonderful. Now, a few weeks ago, that's one of the reasons why we had a conversation where I think this gets into wards and religious communities and families and marriages. We talked about trying to change the way that we view the idea of sin, because we can get caught up in sins of a higher law or a lower law. And we're going to talk about what Paul was encountering with the saints in this regard. But one of the things that prevents, I think, virtue signaling in a church setting is when we stop trying to see sin as the breaking of a commandment that makes us criminals and means that some kind of sin has become a crime that needs to be punished and hurt, and then there's to be pain just so that you won't do it again, is when we begin to see that sin is the breaking of a law that separates us from God, puts some distance so that we're not as comfortable living in His presence, and that brings with us a pain not because we are criminals, but a pain because we have been wounded. And it's in that wounding that we are motivated to go to a healer who's going to heal that pain, help us stop bleeding so that we can return to a state where we are back to being comfortable. Oftentimes when we've committed a crime, criminals, again, like we talked about, run from the police. They run from judges. They lie to judges. They lie to police. They're trying to avoid punishment for their criminal act. When we see sin as a wounding, we want to go to the Lord, to a bishop, to the scriptures, to prayer, all those things that will help us heal of our wounding. And if I'm wounded, I am less likely, I just don't have a need to have to signal to you my virtuosity and how virtuous I am. What I may signal is, I can't judge you because I'm hurting just the same as you are. I have wounds, you have wounds. And because of that, neither one of us is in a place to judge. We're just simply in a place where we need to heal one another. Now, can I tell you one other place that I see this happen a lot? In my private practice as a therapist, and I'm working with people, I constantly run into this struggle with people that are trying to reduce their criminality, and they're going to the sources you would hope they would go to the scriptures, to prayer, to conference talks, to try and understand where they went wrong and to try and aid in their repentance process. But the problem, I think, sometimes is we deal with what I call a scriptural confusion. So we will read about things like fear in the scriptures, and we want to make sure that we are not that we have fear. We want to gain faith, because we've read that the more I have faith, the less I should fear. So we're trying to work on faith, but if I have fear, I don't have faith. And in this virtue signaling misunderstanding, when we're looking at other people's virtue, we miss out on the fact, do we not, that fear is not clinical anxiety. Somebody who has clinical anxiety is not having the fear the scriptures talk about. They have a physical condition where chemically things aren't functioning well, or by genetics they have a problem with panic or anxiety that is causing them great pain and hurt and fear. But it's not the fear of the scriptures. And trying to separate scriptural fear based on lack of faith and clinical anxiety based on lack of serotonin in your brain are two different things. Another one is, the scriptures tell me I need to be meek. I need to become meek and humble and all of those kind of things. But this meekness that King Benjamin is talking about is not passiveness in relationships, where we're getting run over and we're being hurt and we're enabling destructive or unhealthy behavior in a spouse or in kids. That passiveness of people pleasing is not kindness. It's just being nice and enabling and making a situation worse. But we sometimes think that means meek. Or godly guilt. I'm supposed to feel some godly guilt when a commandment has been broken and I'm trying to be healed and return to where I'm supposed to be. But brothers and sisters, godly guilt is not the same as shame. Shame freezes us. Shame causes us to not move, to not act. Shame causes us to shrink and hide away, not just from bishops or from the Lord, but from one another and from relationships. And that is a clinical issue. One last one. We talk about feeling peace of the scriptures. This is the gospel of joy and the plan of happiness. But this peace is not apathy, where sometimes people go, well, I don't have confusion, I don't have conflict anymore. And I say, Yeah, but you've emotionally shut down. That this clinical apathy destroys marriages. I always look at a couple that's struggling in their marriages, and when they can be angry, but when one of them goes apathetic, our marriage is really in trouble because somebody just doesn't care anymore. That's a long way, and they just tired of conflict. That's a long ways from feeling the peace that the gospel is trying to engender. Well, these all come as we get caught up, I think, mistakenly and struggling in a lot of ways with the idea of virtue signaling from other people. Because in these cases, when we're going to do the comparative thing that I need to do, I'm going to compare myself to somebody else. If I think I'm better, then I will be competitive. By pride, I can prove I'm better. You know, in the old days, they might have said, I'm going to prove that I'm the most righteous because I will have the most kids in the ward. You know, in the very earliest days, they might have said, I'm the most righteous, I have the most wives. They would go through these kind of things. Now, what happens, though, is that when we are comparisizing, comparatively looking, and we don't match up. Now we go from, I can't be competitive, therefore I'll stop competing and I will give up. And that's ultimately where poor comparisons or a misunderstanding about wounding and criminality leads us to say, I can't compete, I won't even try. They just get caught in this depressive loop. I'm not going to compete. I can't win. And that can be the signal that is sent by others sending virtue signals, trying to say, I'm better than you. See, I won, you lose, give up. Do you surrender because I'm better? Tough place to go. Now, this is humanality. This is the human condition. Did they do that back during the days of Paul? Absolutely they did. And I want to show you in just a second. The scriptures show that they did exactly that when you had small little house churches trying to figure out how do we get along with each other, especially when some of us are Jewish and some of us are Greek and some of us are more pro-Roman, and you get this mixing together. How do they decide who the most righteous people are? Now, shifting gears for just a second to set this up so we can see how that virtue signaling kicked in. We talked about the fact that by the hair of his chinny chin chin, that Paul is able to get out of the mob and the problems that they were having in the Jerusalem temple, by being able to talk to them and bear his testimony to them about who he was. And as he did so, he then had to appeal to Caesar. So now the Romans are going to take him out of the mob on the temple. Remember that it was Paul's nephew who says, hey, there's 40 guys out here that have sworn an oath to kill you, and they're not going to eat anything until you're dead. Tell it to the Roman centurion there, and they're going to then sneak out of town in the middle of the night and take Paul from Jerusalem 50 miles up the road up to the beautiful seaside port of Caesarea Maritima, built by Herod as a tribute to Caesar, and it was a full Roman city. You know that you're in a Roman city when you got the amphitheater, when you got the horse racing track, which is what this is, when you have the full temples, when you have the libraries, when you have all the things that go with Roman life. And Caesarea, beautiful place to go walk around, and you get a chance to see that Romanness. And Paul was taken there and kind of wasn't necessarily held in prison, but he certainly was there under house arrest, while they A, tried to figure out what to do with him, and 2, Felix, the governor there, was trying to figure out how he could extract a bribe to be able to turn him loose. Paul did not want to get turned loose. A, the Lord had told him he needed to go appeal to Caesar and meet with Caesar. But also, if they had turned him loose, remember, there are 40 guys, probably Sicarii, that want to be able to stab and kill, that are waiting to kill him as soon as he gets to this point. So one of the things that... Okay, now, Paul had a chance to do some writing. We had a little bit of a technical glitch here for just a second. Doing live is a lot of fun, man, I'll tell you. But in case you missed this, Paul had a chance while he was sitting in Caesarea to do some writing. And he's being able to write, we think, about 4 letters from prison. Scholars now tend to believe that 2 of the letters were written from beautiful Caesarea. Those writings ended up being kind of circular writings. And that is that they were meant to go to a number of churches all around. One was to the Colossians up in Thessalonica, in Colossae, near Philippi, where he had such great, wonderful experiences up there. He's going to write a letter up to them. And then the second letter is kind of interesting. It is a circular letter. It's not specific to a certain people or situation. It's more a statement of the things that he believes. We think it was meant to be carried around to different churches along the way. Now, the very earliest documents for this letter don't show a name on it. It's just a circular letter. In some of the later texts, in the later centuries, people started putting the word Ephesians at the top of this letter. And most scholars would say now that probably the addition of Ephesians was a way of putting a name on, a title on this letter, and it was probably meant to go to Ephesus as well as some of the other churches, but not specifically written to the Ephesians. But I want to be able to address some specific things that come out of the letter to the Colossians, because there were some specific problems there. Now, to set this up, maybe the best way to explain this one is the fact that, N.T. Wright has suggested this, and I thought it was a really good analogy. Can you imagine, and you've had this experience, to maybe be in an airport or be in a public place and somebody's talking on their phone and they're talking loudly and you can hear their conversation, but you can't hear what's happening on the other end of the conversation. You might be hearing somebody that says, well, I wouldn't have done that. If I'm her, I'd leave him in a red hot second. I can't believe he said that to her, and that's going to leave bruises, and she just needs to pack up right now and leave him right away. I just can't believe that's happening. Now, as you're listening, you can probably assume what the other person is saying, and you might be able to assume the situation that they're referring to. But all you have is a one-sided conversation from what you can hear your person on your side, what they're saying. Now, in essence, that's what we get in the Pauline letters in the New Testament. We're getting one side of the conversation. Often, Paul is writing to address problems, and we can only guess what the problems are by what he's addressing. There's no guarantees that we don't have the whole information. In Colossae, we have a little better idea because he's a little bit more specific in terms of what he's saying the remedy is, which gives us an idea what the problem is. So let's set up the problem. Remember very early on when Paul and Barnabas are about to go off into the New Testament lands to teach, off to Greece, off to all these places. And the problem is that you have Jews and Greek converts that are going to be eating together and meeting together. And kind of the overly simplistic problem that we have with what the Jerusalem church thought would be a decent solution is they basically said this: to members of the way, the church, the way, in Ephesus, in Corinth, in Philippi, if you're a Jew, keep living the whole law of Moses. If you're Greek or Roman, you don't have to, but at least don't eat the meat from idols. And all of you take care of the poor. What they did unintentionally, I don't know that they had necessarily thought this through because of the kind of provincial bubble that they lived in, was what that would do to the churches out there. What that said is that we're going to have groups of saints sitting down together, meeting together in house churches, with one half living all of the law of Moses and the other half only living a little bit of a portion of it. Some are going to be living the higher law, some are going to be living the lower law. Let me give you an example of how beautifully that might work. Let's say, for instance, that as we come out of the coronavirus thing, the first presidency were to send out a letter and say something like this. And don't quote me that because they're not. But let's say they did. And they said, to all the members in Utah, you have to keep living the commandments as have been given to you. Outside of Utah, if you want to drink tea or coffee, that would be okay. And because we have a lot of poor saints in South America and people that are struggling, outside of Utah, you only have to pay 5% tithing instead of 10. We're trying to help out. But if you were born in Utah, if you grew up in Utah, and you've moved to any of these other places, so you have Utah roots, you still have to live the entire word of wisdom, and you still have to be paying 10%. Brothers and sisters, how long would it take of a ward sitting in, I don't know, Kansas City or New York or Japan or Chile, before you got this group of people sitting around, and a bishop's being called, and they'd say, well, is he a 10%er or is he a 5%er? Is the new Relief Society president a tea drinker or not? Because you know what? Some of us keep it all. Some of us keep the higher commandments. And those people aren't paying as much. They're not doing as much. I can't believe that our Relief Society president is a coffee drinker. Well, I'm going to do my part. And you'd get this split, this fault line between the righteous people, those virtuous people, and those not virtuous people, depending on how you looked at it. That's exactly what was happening in Paul's world. How do I signal how righteous I am? Well, one of the ways I'm going to do it is I'm the full tithe payer. In those places, they would be saying, I keep the whole law of Moses. I've been circumcised. You are the uncircumcised, therefore not as righteous, not as virtuous, not as obedient as I am. And that's exactly what they were doing. Then they took it farther. How do we then determine who the really righteous people is? Because I'm going to have to know that I'm really, really righteous, more than you. Well, here's what they did. So we got this whole level of false piety and virtue signaling that happened in these Greek house churches. And here's what they did. This is from Paul writing in Colossians. Beware, he says, not to let anyone lead you captive through empty and deceitful philosophy, according to human traditions. Human behavior being what it was, these members of these house churches had to have a way to prove, I'm more righteous than you. So they started to bring in extra things that would be virtue signaling of their higher righteousness. So what would that look like? And we're grateful for Paul to at least giving us about 4 of these that we actually know that they were doing. And ultimately, these were the kind of things that led to the split and the apostasy that we knew that would ultimately come. Here's one. This is, again, coming out of Colossians 2. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you with regard to food or drink. Guess what they were doing? Only the righteous people eat certain things. The unrighteous people don't eat certain things. The righteous people have one diet. The unrighteous people have not as righteous a diet. Which one of you? Are you the good diet person or the bad diet person? My righteousness is dependent on what I eat. Okay? Not that we do any of that in today's church, where we start to differentiate, like the ward we were in, that some people were quite upset that we weren't serving we were serving the sacrament with white enriched bread where it should have been whole wheat bread. We want the best for the Lord, therefore we're going to reject white bread for our sacrament. The righteous will eat whole wheat bread, the unrighteous will eat that nasty bleached stuff that's not good for you. Diet was one. Or, he says, with respect to a feast, new moon or Sabbath. I'm a better Sabbath person than you are. Or I keep a new moon, I keep a festival better than you do. We're going to prove the really good people are able to have a better Easter. A more fabulous. The more righteous you are, the better your Christmas looks. The really righteous people have a lot of lights. The unrighteous people don't care less. You know, we're going to try and create these artificial lines about righteousness and not. And who knows in that ancient world exactly how it was they were doing that. Do not allow anyone, he says, to deceive you, insisting on humility and the worship of angels and promoting visions. I have had a vision that says that I'm better than you. Rather than having and people will have visions, and people might even have had angelic visitors that come and speak to them and give them knowledge. Certainly people in the church today have had ancestors come and give them genealogical information. But what happens when these people begin to say, I have had this vision, I need to announce it to everybody, and not only am I out of the goodness of my heart trying to tell you what's going on, but because of that, and I have to announce it in church and publish it, everybody will know how pious I am, and wow, how religious I am. Just amazing how religious I am. Now, that's the kind of thing that was going on. Where they say, by the way, do you know that some of these ancient saints came to visit me? Well, I'm sorry they didn't come to you, but they came to me, so me better, you less. I'm going to let everybody know. And I may do it on open mic Sunday and fast and testimony meeting. I'm going to tell you just how specially pious I am. Finally, he says, there are those that are puffed up with reason by human thinking. We have to remember that so many of these churches operated in this Greek philosophizing, loving the intellect kind of place. And because of that, they pushed hard. That it was still about intellect and understanding, which makes faith a little bit hard sometimes when there's an over-intellectualizing. And I think that Plato was probably wiser than Jesus. You know, and I'm more of a Socrates guy than a Paul guy, because he was pretty dang smart, and I follow him. And on the other side, we may still have had people like on the Jewish side saying, hey, listen, you know, I still follow Gamaliel, even though Paul studied under him and then didn't do so well later. So we get this idea, this battle going on in these house churches, battling how all of this finally works. Okay, so finally, before we wrap up here, the last thing I want to leave you with is that one of the things that Paul was able to ultimately do, and again, we'll finish with this. He is going to finish the book of Colossians by trying to say what I have called grace signaling rather than virtue signaling. How do we know that we have been filled with God's grace and that it is lifting us above ourselves so that we love to keep the commandments, we love to feel that? How does that extend itself out? Here's what he's going to say. Therefore, he says to these wonderful saints, clothe yourselves as the elect of God. What will they look like? Holy and beloved saints with compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. You don't have to signal compassionate hearts and kindness. It emanates from you. And it is not off-putting. It draws people into the body of Christ. Bearing one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another person, just as the Lord has forgiven you, likewise forgive one another. And then he says these final two things. Clothe yourselves in love, which is the bond of perfection. Perfection is not in our actions. Perfection is in our love, in our compassionate hearts, in our kindness. That's the perfection that he's looking for. Not the perfection that we may blast out there for everybody to be in awe of our virtue. And then he says simply this, and let the peace of Christ guide your hearts. Brothers and sisters, it's my testimony that in this process of learning how to not signal falsely our virtue, but as we begin to really fully understand and be filled with His grace, what is signal, what emanates from us is compassionate hearts and kindness and humility and forgiveness. And we do it in a beautiful way, and it enhances around us. I bear you my testimony that this is what He had intended, and this is what lifts congregations and blesses their lives. And I leave that with you in Jesus' name. Amen.